Mr. Howard, thanks very much for talking to us. Let me start with the big picture question. What is this election really all about?
It is all about a choice between massive additional government intervention, largely through higher taxation in people's affairs, and the alternative philosophy of trusting people to know better than governments about how to spend their money.
Although Labor would point out they're still not going to be taxing as a proportion of the economy as much as you did at 24.3%.
David, they're proposing a whole lot of new taxes. And they're basically saying if you don't like those new taxes, well, don't vote for us. And it's a pretty stark choice. They are going to add to the tax burden of the Australian community and to fund much bigger spending. So it's a question of whether we as Australians know better than the government what to do with our own money. Now, obviously, there are differences of degree, but those differences are very sharp.
But do you take their point that as a proportion of the economy, they're still not getting the tax take as high as it has been?
Well, the economy, of course, varies over time, and the strength and size of the economy can alter the tax take.
So right now, you do fear this plan Labor has would actually hurt the Australian economy?
Oh, it will. It will certainly hurt the property market. No doubt about that. I mean, it will have a depressing effect on house values. It will take away the incentive that exists for Middle Australia, who've done well, and we are a middle-class society. We are about the most middle-class society in the world, and when you think about the quintessential Australian dream, it's to work hard, get a bit together, be successful, and retire with security and dignity, and leave it behind to your children. Now, that's a pretty worthwhile aspiration.
And to get a foot in the housing market.
Yeah, yes. And
so on Sunday at the campaign launch, Scott Morrison did announce a new plan to guarantee part of the deposit for first home buyers. Some are concerned about taxpayers being on the hook for bad debts here. Well, what do you think about this sort of approach?
I think it's a much better approach than what Labor's proposing with negative gearing. The advantage of the Morrison approach is that it does something for the first home buyer without degrading the value of existing homeowners' principal asset. I bet the major asset you've got is your house.
Absolutely.
It's my major asset, family home. It far exceeds anything else, and that is the case with most people in Middle Australia. And what Labor is proposing is going to do a lot of damage to that. I mean, this is the last time, the most stupid time to be doing anything to suppress home values, because they're coming off of their own volition at present. Well, why are we going to push the drowning man underwater, to use a metaphor?
But on the government's idea, is this sort of market intervention something you would have done?
Well, it's not something that we contemplated, but the Menzies government, the very founder of our great party, his government in 1963, proposed something that has similar elements.
So this does have precedent in
Australia.
Australia?
Yeah, it does. It has a very noble precedent. If Bob Menzies did it, and he founded the Liberal Party. Now, there were differences, but the principle of the government providing some kind of guarantee to ease people into the housing market for the first time, that's very similar to what Scott announced yesterday.
But didn't your government get the Commonwealth out of that sort of guarantee?
Well, yes, but years later, because it was up and running and highly successful, and it followed the proper model of market intervention. You intervene when there's a gap in the market, and once that gap has been filled, you get out.
And there's a gap now?
And, it's clearly a gap now, yes.
Look, Scott Morrison, most agree, has campaigned well. Whether it's enough, we'll find out on Saturday. He's not been long in the job. Having seen him, though, in the job as leader and Prime Minister, how would you characterise Scott Morrison as in the history of the Liberal Party?
Well, he has a great capacity to explain things. And politics is still the art of persuasion and explanation. I think Scott Morrison can explain things in a way that most Australians can relate to. I think he has done an outstanding job. I think he understands that the Liberal Party is a broad church, and he's made that very clear. And
where does he sit in that broad?
well, I think I would think he sits in a very similar position to what I did. Scott has what you might call solid conservative instincts on certain things, but he's also is looking to the future. When that was me. I mean, I was conservative on some things, but I had a broadly classical liberal view on others, and I think Scott is very similar. But look, every leader's different. I'm not suggesting that he's a clone of me or anybody else. He's his own man.
But is he more like you than perhaps other leaders we've seen?
Oh, look, I don't. That's a futile piece of trivial pursuit. I don't really want to get into that. He's Scott Morrison, and he has brought his own imprimatur, and he's been so warmly received. I've been around, particularly over the last couple of weeks, talking to a lot of people in the party, and gee, they like him because they think he represents them. And what you see is what you get.
Would you like to see him stay in the leadership, win or lose?
Look, I hope he wins, and I hope he remains leader.
And if not?
Well, I don't want to contemplate such an awful outcome as us not winning.
I'll come back to that. Look, you have been working your way around a lot of marginal seats and some not so marginal or some very interesting contests. You've been with Tony Abbott in Warringah.
This morning, yeah.
Yeah, how's that looking?
Oh, well, it's tough. Tony said he's got the fight of his life. But if there are any Warringah voters listening and viewing, which I hope there are in their thousands, David, that... my simple observation is that your electorate is full of people who have worked hard, been pretty successful, accumulated a bit, put a few bob together, and Bill Shorten is coming after you with his higher taxes.
Why do you think Tony Abbott's in trouble in a seat like that?
Well, because there are a whole lot of people who don't like him, such as GetUp and others. And Tony's somebody who's always taken positions on things. And you've got to respect that, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with some of the positions he's taken. You know where he stands. And I think deep down Australians respect people, whether they're of the centre-right or the centre-left. And I can think in the past of people who were on the centre-left but attracted respect because they stated a position.
Is it important for the Liberal Party to have Tony Abbott still in the Parliament?
Well, it's important for the Liberal Party first and foremost to win the seat of Warringah. And if Warringah is won by an independent, there's no guarantee you won't see a repeat of Windsor and Oakeshott. I mean, they're classic examples of people who were elected to represent non-Labor seats ending up supporting a Labor government. So there's something that people in Warringah should contemplate. If you vote for an independent, you could see a repetition of the Windsor-Oakeshott outcome, and that is the installation of a minority Labor government. This election could turn out to be very close. So therefore, a seat such as Warringah, previously always held by the Liberal Party, if that were to go to independent hands, it's as good as handing it to Labor.
But do you see what's happening in Warringah and places like Higgins and Wentworth and so on? There's a disappointment with the Liberal Party for not doing more, particularly on the issue of climate change.
I think Wentworth was a special case. You had the combination of people, some people being angry that their own local member had been dumped as Prime Minister, and also the anger people feel about unnecessary by-elections, something I learnt years ago. In a by-election in Brisbane, in a seat called Ryan, people hate early, unnecessary by-elections. So I think there were special cases. Higgins, well, I'm not sure that the alarm bells that have been rung there are all that accurate. But look, there's a debate about the climate change issue, but in the end, the Australian people are entitled to know the cost of Labor's radical plan on climate change. And the electorate is being told, in effect, to get lost on the question of the costing of Labor's radical plan, and I think that is very unsatisfactory. Tony
Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull and yourself weren't at the party launch on Sunday. It must be the first campaign launch you haven't been to in, I'm guessing, decades?
I don't know. I'm getting old, David. Not quite that old, but David, I wanted to spend Mother's Day with my family, and there was a special reason. One of my daughters, our daughters-in-law, had been a mother for the first time on this Mother's Day. Their first,
you weren't disappointed?
No. Their first child was born only 6 months ago, and on top of that, I'd just come back from a fairly gruelling flight, and I'm flying to Western Australia tonight. So I
You weren't too disappointed not to be there. Was it a reflection, though, that not perhaps yourself, but the other two former Prime Ministers mentioned
think
there
so.
don't really...
I think this is over. I don't know that the presence of all those former Labor Prime Ministers and some subsequent comments by one of them was such a rip-roaring success.
What did you think of Paul Keating's comments?
Well, I disagree with them. I mean, I happen to know quite well and was responsible for the appointment of quite a number of the people who he attacked, and I thought they were entirely unjustified comments to people who have served both sides of Australian politics with a great deal of distinction and honour. People like people like David Irvine and Nick Warner and Duncan Lewis. They've all done wonderful service, and I think to be the recipients of those fairly inappropriate remarks is just pretty poor.
Look, this turnover of Prime Ministers that we've seen since you were there, it has fed into the unhappiness with politics generally. Do you agree? What can be done post-election to try and restore a bit of trust in the political system?
Well, it all, in the end, depends on performance. And both parties have changed their rules, and I think it's clearly going to be the case, David, that whatever the result is, and I hope it's a coalition win, but whatever the result, I think you will have a Prime Minister in either Bill Shorten or Scott Morrison who'll be there for the duration.
You're not a big fan of these sort of rules, though, are you, that lock in the leader?
Now, I generally favour the free market, and you do have these ebbs and flows, and I look back over history and think that if you had a different set of rules at a certain time in history, you might have had a different outcome. And I think in the end, if the leader is holding his party together and is spending time with his or her parliamentary colleagues and governing from the centre of the party as well as the centre of the nation, then that person will be successful.
Some have said this campaign, though, has been particularly nasty, that we need to step back a bit from that to help restore trust in politics.
I think there have been...
Do you think it's been nasty?
Well, I think some elements of it have been nasty, but it hasn't been as physically violent in public meetings as, say, election campaigns in the 60s at the height of the Vietnam War. I mean, I've never been to more bruising, riotous public meetings than in the 1966 election campaign. And so we've got to keep a bit of perspective. But social media has made the exchange more tawdry. It has encouraged people to talk in vitriolic, bilious slogans rather than argue the case, I think.
And is that a reflection on Australia's politicians or Australians?
I think that's a reflection on the whole of our society, and it's not confined to Australia. It's to be found in other great democracies such as Britain and the United States and Canada. Well, we should all try and improve it, and we should all strike down, criticise and slap down verbal excesses on our side as well as on the other side.
Look, things are close in this final week of the campaign, we know, but the Liberals are not yet in a winning position. Is there anything you would do at this point that could put the Liberals over the line?
Look, I think we can win. I'm not saying we will. I think we're still behind. But, David, if I were Bill Shorten, there's one thing I would really lay awake at night worrying about, and that is the primary vote of the Labor Party. If you look at the last three changes of government, and I was intimately involved in the first two, namely 96 when we won and 2007 when we lost, 2013 when Tony Abbott won, on those three occasions, with a week or more out from the election, there was a clear ascendancy in the primary vote of the winning party. And we had a lead in 96 of something like 8 or 10% in the primary. And in 2007, Labor had a lead of 4 or 5%. And in 2013, I think Abbott was 7 or 8% ahead. Now, on this occasion, Labor's primary vote, albeit suppressed, is lower than our admittedly also suppressed primary vote. Now, if I were Bill Shorten, I would worry about that, because that primary vote ascendancy that I spoke of in those earlier polls had become apparent months before, and what it represented was a fundamental shift in attitude by the electorate towards the alternative. Now, I sense as I go around the community, yes, there's some unhappiness with the way that our side has behaved, leadership changes and the like, I accept that, but I find no instinctive warmth towards the alternative. And if you look at those figures, they seem to bear that out.
You said the coalition can still win.
Yes.
What do you think will happen on Saturday?
Well, I think it could be, it could go either way. I really do. I don't think you're going to have an overwhelming result either way. I think it's going to be close. That takes me back to seats where independents are vying. I mean, if you are a resident of one of those seats that normally votes Liberal, and you think, oh, well, I can muck around with an independent or something, it won't really matter, they'll still win. They may not still win. And therefore, by voting for an independent, you're voting for the Labor Party.
Do you think the Liberal Party has done enough, though, to be forgiven by those voters who do
well, look,
upset?
I do, because the economy is functioning well in the circumstances. I mean, the things that people are concerned about, low wage growth, that's to be found all around the world. But we've had remarkably low levels of unemployment. We continue to grow very strongly as an economy, but there are challenges. And the last thing we need is higher taxation, because higher taxation, by definition, subdues growth. And if we all believe in growth, surely we do, you don't want to do anything that subdues it.
What do you think about all the early voting? We've had 3 weeks of it, and it's more than 2.5 million already. Do you think it's too much early voting?
Well, I tend to hold to the view, the market view, if I can put it this way, that if you force people to vote, you should give them the maximum opportunity at their convenience to do so. So, whilst it requires political parties to adjust their campaign techniques, I'm fairly relaxed, even relaxed and comfortable about that.
Speaking of relaxed and comfortable, I mean, at the end of the day, would you be relaxed and comfortable if Labor does manage to win?
Well, I will always be optimistic about the future of Australia, no matter who the government is, but I think we'll be less well governed. I think we'll have more government intervention, we'll have higher taxation, there'll be less encouragement for people to have a go, and it will be a less ambitious Australia if Labor wins. Labor has ambitions for their ideology, they don't seem to have ambitions for the individual fulfilment of each Australian.
Final one, Mr Howard, you've won elections, you've lost elections. For those who are in the field competing on Saturday, do you have any personal advice to them? Because I would imagine it can be a pretty emotional moment after a gruelling 5-week campaign and however long they've been fighting it out in Parliament. What should they be thinking on Saturday?
Well, obviously, until the votes are all counted, they should be doing everything they can, firstly, to accumulate, secondly, to reconcile themselves with or celebrate the outcome. There's no simple piece of advice you can give somebody who just misses out. I mean, life is full of occasions when you just miss out or you just win, and it's a test of the individual character, but always remember, and I'd address this to all, always remember that there are thousands and thousands of people who volunteered their time for nothing to help you, and never forget the debt you owe to your own political party. I have very little sympathy for people who get themselves elected under a Liberal or Labor banner and then, in a sense, throw dirt in the face of the volunteers that put them there. I think that is contemptible behaviour.
Like Julia Banks?
Yeah, well, I think she did behave very badly. And she was elected as a Liberal. I campaigned for her. I spent a few hours in her electorate and thought she was a very nice person. I was very disappointed. But I mean, it's one thing to get elected as an independent, somebody like Ted Mack, who I knew well.
Or Karen Phelps.
I mean, they got elected as independents. It's different. But somebody who's elected as a Liberal and then leaves the party and makes unspecified allegations, I think that's poor behaviour. But, you know, I'd say to all of people, you're part of a great democratic experiment. And there's lots of people who work hard and they stand there in the rain sometimes and hand out tickets and knock on doors. I mean, never forget that. Never forget the debt you owe to the party that brought you. And as Ronald Reagan's famous phrase of always dance with the one who brung you is a lesson in political life for all people, whether they vote Labor or Liberal.
John Howard, always good to talk. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.